If it's okay with you, I don't know how long it's been, but would we be able to talk and play the 911 call with you?
Not with me here.
Okay. Can you tell me why?
No, I will not listen to the 911 tape. I've heard it, but I don't allow myself to be hurt like that anymore.
Abilene 911, go ahead.
I accidentally killed somebody. She's bleeding all over the bed. Because I stabbed her.
Okay, where'd you stab her?
Lots of places.
When I listen to that 911 tape, one, I go right back to that night. Hearing his voice and knowing, like, hearing him lie. I don't want to hear the fake crying and everything, because all it does, and you can probably already tell, is it brings back the rage from that first moments of learning who he is as a person. They brought her out of the house, and I kept telling her, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I had no idea. There was nothing I could do except sit there and just fall apart and lose everything.
You think you killed somebody?
No, I know I did. My sister.
From the moment that Paris killed Ella, I had to become a divided mother, because up until that point, it never felt wrong to love either one of my children.
I look at the two of them and I'm like, oh God, what have I created?
Nobody prepares you for when it's the two people you love most in the world and one kills the other. What do you do then?
So this is my office, and well, it's just maybe an extension of my personality. Artwork by my kids. These are all letters between Paris and I. And for the first 4 or 5 years, I mean, he wrote all the time. Long, long letters. So this is really old and dirty. But this is Paris's footprint from the day that he was born. It is just so amazing to me, you know, to think that they go from this tiny little thing to whatever they grow up to be. I miss that Paris. I would love nothing more than to have that Paris back. But, you know, I try not to spend too much time thinking about that. It's never going to happen. So this is Paris, probably around 26 or 27 years old. It's almost like whatever expression he has on his face and stuff, it just never makes it to his eyes. He's just very calm and placid. That's what I think of when I think of Paris. Cold lakes with dark bottoms. Do I think I ever knew the real Paris? No. I think I know more of the real Paris now. But at that time, I had no concerns that he was going to become who he is now. So the only thing that I've ever been able to tell parents
over the years is you are not alone, and that it's, okay to talk about it and deal with it for the rest of your life. If you really think about it, Paris saved me, but he wasn't born to be my savior. Just like he destroyed me, but he wasn't born to be my destroyer, right? I mean, for sure, over the years, that's been a very hard contradiction to hold on to. The fact that the first person that I ever loved that much did that, yes. So that's when I got, like, sober. I had a purpose. When Paris was born, I had no idea that there was an actual real love like that, but I had dreamed about it my entire life, hoping that it was real. Like, I had never seen anything so perfect in my life. I told him I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. But I promise I will always love you, and I will always be there for you, no matter what. I saw it as a new chapter, and, well, stories don't always go the way you want them to. When Paris was young and I had to go to work or go to class, I would take him to, his daycare center. And he was always fine. He would, give me my hug and go and play and all of that stuff. And then I would come back, that moment where he would turn around and see me, like no matter what he was doing, he would turn around and he would see me, and his face would light up, and he'd like, Mom, and run across the room and jump into your arms. When your kid looks at you like that, that is like the best feeling in the whole wide world. Like, I just love that feeling. I can still remember that feeling. But he laughed a lot. He was a goofy kid. He wasn't dark or troublesome. He was just a kid who seemed happy. No signs of anything, right? I had nothing. Paris was with me the day I found out I was pregnant with Ella. He was playing with this Lego that he had built. And when the doctor came in and she was like, "Oh, congratulations, you're having a baby," he dropped it and it just shattered everywhere. Paris hated it. He was not a happy camper. Mostly it all boils down to, I don't want to share my mom. So the day Ella was born, he came into the room, and I was so worried. I was like, oh, please let this go well. And then he saw Ella. Do you want to hold her? And he was like, yeah. And he took her, and he looked down at her, and then he looked up at me, and he had this look on his face, and he was like, oh, Mama.
He said, she is beautiful. I love her. And I'm like, oh, thank God. Oh, thank God.
Dia nak kata apa? Ellie, talk to me.
He fell in love immediately. I saw it happen on his face. And it really, really, really felt authentic to me. After he was arrested, there were still times when I walked into that prison that for a half second, maybe an eighth of a second, maybe less, I'd still get that look from Paris. And then everything that had happened would come between us. And then I remember my son is a psychopath. He murdered his sister. When everything first happened, there was no way I could look at pictures from the past. But now when I look at these pictures, you know, I can look and I see Paris and I remember the moment and everything. But all the memories have a little bit of sadness in them. That's how I feel when I look at all these pictures. So this picture of Paris and Ella was taken not long after Ella was born. I think it's pretty obvious from the picture he is no longer the child that does not want anything to do with a pregnancy or a little sister. It was a complete 180. I mean, and it happened instantaneously. And, you know, they would just hang out together. He would talk to her, play with her.
Ella. Ella.
He really enjoyed Ella. I don't remember at any point in time ever feeling worried with Paris around Ella. It's like people think that I sat and watched Paris turn into a psychopathic monster over the years and never did anything to save my daughter. And, you know, they're wrong. He was a really good big brother. I immediately saw what I thought was a good sibling relationship. I remember Ella got colic, and for like 3 months, Ella is just screaming. And she had this toy plastic phone. She could like push the buttons on, and it had like princesses would talk to you. And Paris figured out that if he put this phone up to her ear and he kept the thing ringing, that she would lay there with this phone ringing and be like, he took it upon himself to keep the phone up there and keep pushing the button so she'd be happy. I remember thinking, what an amazing big brother, that he's willing to do that for his sister. Well, I asked him if he remembered it. I said, do you remember that time? I said, it's little things like that, Paris, that make it so hard for me to understand why you killed your sister. And he laughed, and he said, yeah, I remember that. He said, you know what I was honestly thinking? He said, I remember thinking, why won't she just shut the F up? And that is not what I saw at all.
What do you have to say, Ella?
I saw a big brother helping his sister feel better. I never thought that he was going to hurt anybody. But then again, I learned after Paris that we don't really know anybody like we think we do. You know, even the people closest to us, we don't know what's going on inside their head. I don't think I knew that Paris. I think that all children have a point where they realize for the first time that their parents aren't godlike, they're human. So I think it was almost like culture shock, maybe, because Paris had never seen the addict part of my personality. I mean, he saw me acting erratically and impulsively. It had to have been hard for him. He was starting to isolate more. I mean, he became moodier, and it got pretty ugly. So one day, I asked Paris to sit down, and I'm like trying to have a conversation with him. And the entire time that I'm trying to have a conversation with him, he's just looking at me, no expression on his face, deadpan. And he's going, bitch, whore, slut, bitch, whore, slut. Just repeating it over and over and over while I'm trying to talk to him. Never seen him talk to me like that before. But when I would try to be like, listen, I get it, you're mad. That's a little much. Like, I am still your mother. He didn't care. He lost all respect for me. I had never seen him act like that before. I definitely believe that my relapse played a role in what he did to Ella. But I never still, through all of that, would have thought he had homicidal thoughts. He hid it pretty damn well. I was running late for work because Ella was in the bathtub. The sitter was in there with her, and she kept saying to me, just one more hug, Mama, just one more kiss. She's wet, you know, I've got dressed for work, she's all wet. And I'm like, okay. So I give her a hug and a kiss, and I'm like, that'll dry before I get to work. And I go to like leave, and she's like, wait, there's one more hug, one more kiss. I think she did that like 3 or 4 times. But, you know, I wasn't gonna give up the opportunity to hug her. It didn't matter that my work shirt was soaking wet. And I'm so glad now that I gave her every single one. That I was late, that I was wet. Yeah, because that's the last time I ever got to do that. He was angry with me when I left for work.
Paris?
I remember giving him a hug next to the front door. And I remember telling him, I know you're mad at me right now and you don't want to talk to me. But just remember, I love you and we can get through anything together. And he was just looking at me, just that calm, cold stillness. When I left, he had already made up his mind to kill somebody. The first year, I didn't really go out at all. Way too much anxiety. Panic attacks, crying. I mean, I could not hold myself together in public. There was the depression, there was the rage. I mean, guilt was really, really, really heavy on me for the longest time. I mean, it's been 18 years, and I still don't really enjoy being in public. You know, when I see a brother and sister that look like they're about the same age difference, I look at them and I think to myself, what the hell happened? I'm her mom, you know, I was supposed to protect her. And I didn't. Still, at this point, 18 years later, I mean, it doesn't ever go away. They asked me to sit down, and at this point, I'm so worked up. They're like, your daughter has been hurt, is what they told me. So as a mom, when you hear your child has been hurt, you don't want to sit around and hear anything else. I said, take me to my daughter now. And then they said, well, she's dead. And at that point, I just remember losing consciousness, blacking out. And then I remember processing in my mind, well, if Ella's hurt and she's gone, they haven't said anything about Paris. Like, where's Paris? And then that's when they told me that they had Paris in custody because he was the one who murdered his little sister. And at that point, the only thing I can really remember is I felt like they made no sense. I remember feeling like I just had to get out of there. I just had to get to my kids. I jumped in my car and I took off. And they're all following me home. And I drove up to my house. I haven't talked about this in a long time. There are media vans all over the road. And they brought her out of the house. And as soon as they brought the stretcher out of the house, and I saw her in that bag, I lost my hearing. I didn't hear a thing. I could see people talking at me. I could see their mouths moving, but I couldn't hear a thing they were saying. And I went over to Ella. She had a black eye. She had this big contusion, this big bump on her head. And I kept telling her, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I had no idea. I kept telling her not to leave me. I was the mother to them both. I am the mother of the victim, and I am the mother of the murderer. The only thing I wanted more than having Ella back at that point was to be able to see my baby. Because as crazy as it sounds, I had just seen a dead child of mine. And even though I knew he was the reason for the pain I was in, he is my baby too. And I need to have hands on him to know that he is okay. I need to see with my eyes that this other love of mine is physically sound. That's the only thing I cared about. I needed to see my child. I asked so many times for somebody to take me to my child, and they would not take me to see Paris. They said that he had not asked for me, and until he asked for me, I could not see him. And I didn't know what to do. There was nothing I could do except sit there and just fall apart and lose everything. And everybody left. And then I was sitting in my house on my couch, and the house was so quiet, so quiet. I hadn't lived in a quiet house for 13 years, and it was so quiet. And as I'm like sitting there on the couch, you know, I haven't slept now for 24 hours. I'm looking out the front window, and this school bus pulled up to pick up the kids across the street, and it hit me. I mean, it like really hit me. I will never be doing anything like that again. And why do they get to put their kids on the bus and mine are gone?
Those of you that did not know us that well, or know our children that well, usually was something that my children and I could always relate to. Ella wanted to be a singer. Paris has always loved his music, and I don't really know what to say at a time like this because, you know, what can you say? So, but I do want to say thank you so much for keeping us in your thoughts. And please keep Paris in your thoughts. He needs a lot of support right now. And thank you. Thank you for being here.
After Paris killed Ella, I had to remind myself on a daily basis, this is not a monster. This is your son, and you love him, and he is a human being. In my mind, I had to separate. On one side, I was Ella's mom, and on this side, I was Paris's mom. And sometimes, in order to be his mom, I had to shut this door for a little bit. And it's just what I had to do. I couldn't have lived with myself if I had not been there for my child. I had already lost everything. I was not going to lose my sense of who I was as a person. I wasn't going to let anybody take that from me. I finally get to go see Paris. And I don't even have the words or know how to begin to explain how messed up I was. And when I came in the room, Paris was sitting in the corner, the farthest corner, I remember. It was like he was in his defensive position. And he was just looking at me, like he was just waiting to see what I was going to do. I just walked across the room to him and I pulled him up out of the chair and I just hugged him. I'm shaking, I'm crying, I'm like panicking, I'm shell-shocked. I can't even begin to explain it. And then I realized as I'm hugging him that he's not hugging me back. He wasn't doing anything, just like dead. And I kind of like pulled back some, and he looks at me and he goes, "So what are you gonna do now?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" He said, "You always told me that the only way you could ever hurt somebody, kill somebody, is if they hurt one of your children." He said, "So what are you gonna do now?" And I remember thinking, who is this person? And where is my Paris? And feeling so unnerved. I don't really know how to explain it. He was a different person. It was the very first time I ever saw behind that mask. And so I just told him, I have no clue what we're gonna do now. But I made you a promise once when you were born that I was gonna love you no matter what. And I'm always gonna do the best I can to be a good mom to you. And I don't know what that looks like now, but that's what I'm still gonna do.
How old is Ella?
4. I woke up and I was hallucinating.
You were hallucinating?
Yes, and I thought my sister was a demon and I killed her.
He told the police he laid down with Ella to help her go to sleep. And then he must have fallen asleep also. And then at some point, he woke up and he looked over and he saw a pumpkin-headed demon thing, and that he thought he had to kill it in order to protect Ella. And that is not the way that it happened at all. What really happened to Ella that night was Paris convinced the babysitter to leave. He goes to the kitchen. He gets the knife. He came into the room. Ella's sleeping. The first thing he did to her was hit her. Because he told me later that he wanted her to be awake because he wanted her to know who was hurting her. And he stabbed her 17 times after beating her and choking her. And he really, really enjoyed it. There was semen found on the inside of Paris's underwear. And the theory is that the act of murder you know, caused him sexual pleasure. After I learned that my son derived pleasure from seeing people suffer, for the first time I started to wonder, like, is my son evil? So here we have a whole bunch of letters. Some are just about, you know, music. Some are about what he's doing at school there. Some of the letters hurt me more than others. He says, I remembered something the other day. I've told you that I thought about killing someone subconsciously for a while before I killed Ella. I remembered yesterday that I had thought about it acutely in 5th grade. When you took away my video games, I thought about how if I killed you, Ella and I could do whatever we wanted. And you know how I thought about doing it? Stabbing you in your sleep. Morbid irony. I did not see a child who was sitting in his bedroom calculating how to murder me so he could play his video games. I didn't see that person until Ella died. I do miss this face. I mean, I've had to stop myself a couple of times from like writing a letter. And, you know, when my mom died, I talked to him because, I mean, I had cut off all contact. And then when my mother died last year, and, you know, he was calling to talk to my mother, you know, I had to answer the phone and tell him. I answered the phone, and he was like, is this you, Mom? And, you know, he sounded, well, of course, he sounded like Paris. He is Paris, but, you know, I heard his voice, and it just kind of fell back into those old patterns. And, you know, he was like, is this you, Mom? And I was like, yeah, it's me. Hey, kid. And I was like, I answered the phone because I just had to tell you that your grandmother is dead. And, you know, and I wanted to keep talking. But I knew better. So I just asked him if, you know, if he was okay, and that I loved him. I did tell him I loved him, and that we could go back to not speaking again. And we both agreed that was for the best. But yeah, I miss him. Parenthood is painful. There are no promises. Your children may not turn out the way you want them to. And I do not like the person that my child became, but I still loved him. I could not have walked away from Paris. It was a really hard thing to finally do later on. But at that time, when he was 13 years old, kid needed help. Nobody was gonna love him as much as I do to get it for him. So even though I know it's for the best, and I know it's the healthiest and safest option, it still went against everything I believe. So stop talking to him. Yeah, I miss him. I just don't miss what he does or who he is. And I experienced enough of that to know that no matter how bad I miss him, it's not worth it.
Do you remember where you stabbed her?
In the neck. I saw light in her eyes and I said, no more.
Still, I'm looking for remorse.
The rain started just after midnight, slamming against the empty highway outside Palm Ridge, Florida, like the sky was trying to erase something. Deputies would later say the road looked abandoned that night. No traffic, no headlights, just black asphalt cutting through miles of swamp and pine forest. At 2:13 a.m., a truck driver spotted the car first. White sedan, driver's door hanging open, engine still running, hazard lights blinking into the darkness like a silent distress signal. The trucker pulled over for less than 30 seconds before calling 911. He said one thing stayed with him forever. The purse was still on the front seat. Women did not leave purses behind. When deputies arrived, they found the sedan empty. No blood, no signs of a crash, no footprints visible in the mud because the storm had washed the ground clean. 26-year-old Melissa Grant had disappeared without a scream, without a witness, without a trace. The only sound surrounding the scene was the ticking of the hazard lights and rain hammering the roof of the abandoned car. By sunrise, Palm Ridge was already in panic. Melissa was not the kind of woman people expected to vanish. She worked mornings at a dental office 3 miles from downtown. She volunteered at church fundraisers. She called her mother every evening at exactly 7 o'clock. Friends described her as predictable in the safest way possible. Same coffee shop every morning, same route home, same apartment overlooking the marina. The kind of routine investigators love because routines leave patterns. Patterns leave evidence. But this case gave detectives nothing. Inside the car, they found Melissa's keys still in the ignition. Her purse untouched, wallet intact, $83 cash folded inside. Her necklace lay broken near the passenger seat, tiny silver links scattered across the floor mat. Detectives photographed every inch of the vehicle under floodlights while reporters gathered behind yellow tape, shouting questions into the humid Florida dawn. No one had answers. The first theory came quickly. Carjacking gone wrong. Except the car had not been stolen. Robbery. Except nothing was missing. Voluntary disappearance. Except Melissa had been planning her sister's baby shower the next morning and had left groceries in her apartment refrigerator hours earlier. Then came the detail that changed everything. A highway patrol officer noticed dirt smeared along the rear bumper. Not ordinary dirt. Gray sand mixed with crushed white shell fragments. Detectives traced it to an abandoned fishing access road, nearly 12 miles south of where the sedan was found. Search teams moved into the area within hours. That was where they found the shoe. One white sneaker buried halfway in swamp mud. Melissa's size. The discovery triggered helicopters, divers, canine units, and a media frenzy spreading across Florida. News stations interrupted broadcasts with the same phrase over and over again. Florida woman vanishes in chilling cold case. For 3 days, search crews dragged nearby canals. Volunteers marched through mosquito-infested wetlands carrying flashlights at night. The sheriff promised the public they were closing in on critical evidence. But privately, detectives already feared the worst. Because experienced investigators know something terrifying about disappearances. The first 48 hours decide almost everything, and those hours were slipping away. By day 5, rumors flooded Palm Ridge harder than the rainstorms. Some believed Melissa had been abducted by a drifter seen sleeping behind a gas station off Route 41. Others whispered about a local mechanic with a violent temper. A waitress claimed she overheard truckers discussing a woman screaming near the marina. Every tip sounded urgent. Every lead collapsed under scrutiny. Then another twist surfaced. Melissa had received 3 unanswered calls the night she vanished. All from a payphone. The location stunned detectives. The payphone stood outside a shuttered convenience store 30 miles away in Broward County. Surveillance cameras in the area were broken. Fingerprints lifted from the phone belonged to dozens of unknown individuals. Investigators had no idea who placed the calls or why. But one detail disturbed them. The final call came 6 minutes before Melissa disappeared. Detectives subpoenaed phone records, interviewed ex-boyfriends, co-workers, neighbors, former classmates, even random customers from the dental office. Everyone repeated the same thing. Melissa had no enemies, no secret affairs, no dangerous connections, nothing. And that frightened investigators more than anything else. Because random violence is harder to predict, harder to stop, harder to solve. Weeks turned into months. The search grids shrank. Helicopters disappeared. News vans left town. Palm Ridge slowly returned to normal on the surface, but Melissa's face remained everywhere. Grocery store bulletin boards, church entrances, gas station windows. Missing. Detectives re-examined the car repeatedly. Fibers, hair samples, fingerprints, trace evidence hidden inside seat fabric. They found one unidentified print on the rear passenger door, but it matched nobody in state databases. DNA technology in 1998 was still primitive compared to modern standards. Labs preserved samples, hoping future science might uncover what current investigators could not. Then came the anonymous letter. Postmarked Jacksonville. No return address. Inside was a single sentence typed in black ink. She was crying before she got in the truck. No signature. No explanation. Detectives nearly tore the state apart chasing truck registrations. Hundreds of interviews followed. Thousands of labor hours vanished into dead ends. The FBI joined briefly, building a behavioral profile suggesting the abductor was likely local, socially invisible, familiar with swamp terrain, capable of blending into ordinary life. The profile haunted Palm Ridge, because it implied something unbearable. The killer might already be standing beside everyone in grocery store lines, church pews, school events. Watching. Waiting. Years passed. Melissa's parents stopped giving interviews after reporters began camping outside their home during anniversaries of the disappearance. Her father developed insomnia. Her mother refused to move from the house because she feared Melissa might somehow return and find nobody waiting. The sheriff changed. Detectives retired. Evidence boxes gathered dust in climate-controlled storage rooms beneath fluorescent lights. But every few years, the case exploded back into headlines. A fisherman discovered bones near Cedar Bay. Not Melissa. A convicted serial offender confessed from prison. False confession. A psychic claimed Melissa was buried beneath an abandoned motel. Nothing. Palm Ridge became trapped inside an endless cycle of hope and devastation. And somewhere during those 27 years, the suspect lived quietly among ordinary people. He attended barbecues, paid taxes, smiled at neighbors, while detectives stared at faded photographs wondering what they had missed. The breakthrough arrived from a place nobody expected. Not from a witness. Not from a confession. From a digital archive technician reviewing evidence for a statewide cold case initiative in 2025. The technician scanned old files into a modern forensic database when she noticed something strange buried inside the original evidence logs. A cigarette, but recovered near the abandoned fishing road, had never been fully processed because contamination concerns in 1998 made testing unreliable. The item had been sealed away and forgotten. Modern forensic analysts reopened the evidence. Within days, they recovered partial DNA. Within weeks, they found a familial match linked to a man living less than 40 miles from Palm Ridge. 58-year-old Daniel Mercer. Divorced. Former delivery driver. No violent criminal record. Neighbors described him as quiet. Invisible. The kind of man nobody remembered noticing. Detectives surveilled Mercer for almost 3 months before making contact. During that surveillance, investigators uncovered details that made veteran officers physically sick. Mercer had worked routes passing directly through Palm Ridge in 1998. He owned a pickup truck matching vague witness descriptions buried deep inside forgotten interview transcripts. And most chilling of all, he had once lived less than 2 miles from the abandoned fishing road where Melissa's shoe was discovered. The arrest happened before sunrise. Just like the disappearance. Federal agents and local deputies surrounded Mercer's small rental home, while neighbors peeked through curtains in disbelief. Television helicopters circled overhead before noon. Reporters flooded streets that had stayed silent for decades. Florida cold case cracked after 27 years. Suspect lived unnoticed for decades. The headlines spread nationwide within hours. But even after the arrest, the mystery refused to die. Because Mercer denied everything. No confession. No explanation. No indication of where Melissa's body had been hidden. Investigators searched properties connected to Mercer across 3 counties. Cadaver dogs reacted near an overgrown patch of land behind a demolished trailer site, but excavation uncovered only animal remains and rusted debris. Families who believed the arrest would finally bring closure instead found themselves trapped inside a new nightmare. Questions without answers. And one terrifying possibility. What if Melissa was not the only victim? The question spread through Palm Ridge faster than the original disappearance ever had. What if there were others? Not copycats. Not unrelated cases buried in old police archives. Real victims. Women who vanished quietly across decades while Daniel Mercer drifted through Florida highways like a ghost nobody bothered to remember. Detectives reopened missing persons reports stretching back to the late 80s. Boxes stacked floor to ceiling inside the county records building. Dust-covered files. Faded Polaroids. Handwritten witness statements yellowed with age. Investigators who once believed they were solving a single abduction suddenly found themselves staring into something far darker. Patterns began appearing almost immediately. Women between 20 and 35. Late-night disappearances. Vehicles abandoned near isolated roads or marshland. No signs of robbery. No bodies recovered. One detective reportedly walked out of the records room pale and shaking after realizing 3 unsolved disappearances had occurred within 30 miles of Mercer's former delivery routes. For 27 years, the cases had sat in separate counties. Separate databases. Separate investigations. Nobody connected them. Until now. News stations erupted with non-stop coverage. Retired detectives flooded phone lines offering old notes, forgotten suspicions, theories buried decades earlier. Families of missing women drove across the state carrying photographs that had not been publicly displayed in years. Every grieving parent wanted the same answer. Did Mercer take my daughter too? The sheriff's department refused to speculate publicly, but behind closed doors, investigators were already building a task force. Operation Lantern. The goal was simple. Reconstruct Daniel Mercer's life year by year. Every address. Every employer. Every traffic stop. Every woman who disappeared near his orbit. And the deeper they dug, the worse it became. Mercer had spent years working independent delivery contracts across Florida and southern Georgia. Furniture shipments. Hardware supplies. Refrigeration equipment. Temporary routes that placed him in small towns for days at a time before he vanished again. The kind of work perfect for someone who did not want roots. Perfect for someone hunting opportunity. Neighbors described him with eerie consistency. Quiet. Polite. Forgettable. A man who waved hello but never stayed long enough for conversation. One former co-worker remembered Mercer eating lunch alone in his truck every day for nearly 6 years. Another recalled seeing scratches along Mercer's forearms once during the summer of 2003. Mercer claimed he fell hiking near a canal. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? Predators survive because ordinary people rarely expect evil to wear a calm face. Then investigators uncovered something buried inside an evidence envelope from 1998. A photograph. One that had somehow never been digitized. The image showed tire tracks near the abandoned fishing road where Melissa's shoe had been discovered. For decades the photo sat unnoticed because forensic technology at the time could not conclusively identify the tread pattern. Modern enhancement software changed everything. The tire impressions matched a discontinued all-terrain model installed on Mercer's pickup truck in late 1997. Suddenly the entire case exploded. Cable news anchors called it one of the biggest cold case breakthroughs in Florida history. Reporters camped outside the courthouse day and night hoping for leaks from investigators. Social media transformed Mercer into a national obsession. Amateur sleuths dissected every known photograph of the man, searching for clues hidden in plain sight. People who attended high school with Mercer began sharing memories online. He barely talked. He always watched people. He had dead eyes. Whether those memories were real or distorted by hindsight no longer mattered. Public opinion had already convicted him. But detectives still faced one massive problem. They had no body, no murder weapon, no confession, and defense attorneys knew it. Mercer appeared in court wearing a faded blue button-down shirt and thin glasses, looking more like a retired accountant than the center of a nationwide cold case nightmare. Cameras flashed nonstop as deputies escorted him through crowds screaming Melissa's name. Mercer never reacted. Not once. No emotion. No anger. No fear. Just that same blank expression investigators had begun to hate. Prosecutors charged him with kidnapping and presumed homicide based on DNA evidence, circumstantial connections, and newly reconstructed timelines. Legal analysts immediately warned the case would be difficult without physical remains. Then came another shock. A woman from Savannah contacted investigators after recognizing Mercer's face on television. Her voice reportedly trembled throughout the entire interview, because she believed she had escaped him. In 1994, she claimed, a delivery driver offered to help after her car broke down outside a rural gas station near the Florida border. The man seemed polite at first, soft-spoken, harmless, but during the drive, he allegedly began asking strange questions. Did anyone know where she was? Was she married? Would somebody notice if she disappeared overnight? The woman said fear hit her so hard, she jumped from the moving truck when it slowed near an intersection. She fractured her wrist, escaping through roadside brush, and never reported the encounter because she believed nobody would take her seriously. Then she saw Mercer's face 27 years later, and she started screaming. Investigators tracked down records confirming Mercer worked deliveries in that region during the exact month of the alleged incident. The task force widened. So did the panic. Families across Florida revisited old nightmares they thought were buried forever. Missing posters resurfaced online. Candlelight vigils returned to towns that had spent decades trying to move on. Some residents began openly wondering how many predators had slipped unnoticed through their communities before DNA technology finally caught up. Then investigators searched Mercer's final known storage unit. What they found inside chilled even veteran homicide detectives. Boxes. Dozens of them. Meticulously labeled. Newspaper clippings about disappearances. Maps marked with circles around remote fishing roads and swamp access points. Polaroids of highways. Receipts dating back nearly 30 years. And buried beneath old blankets, detectives discovered a collection of women's jewelry wrapped carefully in cloth. Necklaces. Rings. Bracelets. None immediately identifiable. But one item stopped investigators cold. A silver chain missing a tiny section near the clasp. Melissa Grant's mother reportedly collapsed when detectives showed her the photograph. It matched the necklace Melissa wore the night she vanished. The evidence transformed the investigation from circumstantial to terrifyingly personal. Still, Mercer refused to speak. Interrogators tried everything. Sympathy. Aggression. Silence. False empathy. Nothing worked. He sat motionless under fluorescent lights for hours, answering nearly every question the same way. I don't remember. Investigators started noticing something deeply unsettling about Mercer during interviews. Whenever detectives mentioned locations connected to disappearances, Mercer sometimes smiled slightly. Not enough for cameras to easily catch, but enough for officers in the room to notice. One detective later described it as the look of somebody enjoying a private joke. And the longer the investigation continued, the more impossible it became to separate fact from horror. Because new names kept surfacing. A waitress missing since 1991. A college student who vanished during spring break in 2004. A divorced mother last seen near a roadside motel outside Jacksonville. Cases once considered unrelated now pointed toward a single shadow moving quietly across decades. The FBI joined the task force permanently. Behavioral analysts built timelines stretching across 4 states. Geographic profilers identified travel patterns consistent with organized predatory behavior. Retired criminal psychologists studying Mercer's background uncovered reports of animal mutilation near his childhood home during the 70s, though no direct evidence tied him to those incidents. The media frenzy intensified after one former neighbor revealed Mercer frequently burned trash late at night behind his trailer during the early 2000s. Another remembered hearing metallic banging sounds from a shed he refused to let anyone enter. Search warrants followed. Cadaver dogs searched old properties. Ground-penetrating radar scanned concrete slabs. Excavation teams dug through swamp edges under brutal Florida heat while helicopters filmed overhead. For weeks, investigators found nothing. Then came the bone fragment. Tiny. Buried deep beneath compacted soil behind an abandoned workshop once rented by Mercer 15 years earlier. Forensic analysts could not immediately determine whether it belonged to a human adult or animal remains, but the discovery reignited nationwide attention instantly. Florida cold case horror deepens. Could there be more victims? The headlines became relentless. And through all of it, Mercer remained silent. No interviews. No statements. No visible emotion, even when prosecutors described Melissa's final moments inside court filings. That silence began affecting the entire town. Palm Ridge stopped feeling normal after dark. Residents started locking doors earlier. Parents who once let teenagers drive coastal roads at night suddenly tracked locations through phone apps. The old fear returned stronger than before, because now people understood something horrifying. The monster had never looked like a monster. He looked like everyone else. At Melissa's old church, parishioners held a vigil marking 27 years since her disappearance. Rain poured again that night, almost identical to the storm from 1998. Candles flickered beneath umbrellas while her mother stood clutching a framed photograph with trembling hands. "We still don't know where she is," she whispered to reporters. That sentence echoed across every broadcast in America. Because despite the arrest, despite the DNA, despite the evidence, Melissa Grant was still missing. And somewhere inside Daniel Mercer's silence lay the answer that could finally end decades of nightmares. Or expose something even worse. Inside the interrogation room, time stopped behaving normally. 48 hours after the first formal questioning began, Daniel Mercer still sat in the same chair, wrists cuffed to the table, posture unchanged, eyes occasionally drifting to the corner of the room as if something invisible lived there. Detectives rotated in and out like clockwork, each one bringing a different angle, a different strategy, a different level of controlled pressure. Nothing worked. Mercer's responses stayed flat, repetitive, almost mechanical. "I don't remember." That sentence became the heartbeat of the entire case. Outside, the building was no longer just a sheriff's office. It had turned into a command center wrapped in media chaos. Satellite trucks lined the street. Reporters shouted updates into live cameras every hour. The phrase "Florida cold case monster" trended nationally. But inside those walls, there was no drama, no cinematic confession, only exhaustion building in the eyes of seasoned investigators who had spent their careers believing truth eventually surfaces under pressure. Here, truth refused to move. FBI behavioral analysts studied Mercer through glass observation panels. They noted something unusual. He did not display the typical stress markers of suspects under interrogation. No passing, no sweating, no verbalos que laschen. Instead, there was stillness, a calm that felt engineered rather than natural. One profiler described it as emotional vacancy with structure, the kind of psychological pattern sometimes associated with long-term compartmentalization. But even that theory didn't explain everything. Because every so often, Mercer would tilt his head slightly when certain details were mentioned. Specific roads, specific dates, specific names. And each time, the smallest flicker passed across his expression, gone before cameras could capture it, but not missed by the detectives watching him in person. It was not fear. It was recognition. And that scared them more. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation room, the investigation was expanding at a pace nobody could fully control. Operation Lantern had evolved into a multi-agency framework spanning 3 states. Analysts reprocessed every missing persons case within a 100-mile radius of Mercer's known movements from 1989 to 2006. Old archives were digitized overnight. Paper files were scanned in bulk. Entire rooms of forgotten evidence were suddenly alive again under modern forensic systems. And patterns began tightening. Not loose similarities. Not vague overlaps. Precision. Disappearances clustered along Mercer's documented delivery routes. Gaps in time matched his employment transitions. Even fuel receipts recovered from storage units painted a map of motion that, in hindsight, looked disturbingly deliberate. A former logistics manager who once worked with Mercer was brought in for questioning. He described Mercer as unremarkable in every way that matters. He remembered him arriving early, leaving late, never complaining, never socializing. But one detail resurfaced during testimony that investigators could not ignore. Mercer always volunteered for the longest routes. The isolated ones. The overnight drives. The rural deliveries no one else wanted. At the time, it seemed like dedication. Now it looked like selection. Then came the second breakthrough. A forensic linguist reviewing the anonymous 1998 letter noticed something overlooked for decades. The sentence, "She was crying before she got in the truck," had been typed with a specific spacing irregularity between two words. Modern typing analysis suggested the message likely came from an older mechanical device, not a standard office printer of that era. Investigators traced possible machines still in use during the late 90s. One category stood out: portable typewriters used in field logistics and delivery dispatch offices. Units that Mercer had access to. The letter stopped being random. It started feeling personal. Back inside interrogation, pressure shifted. Detectives stopped asking open questions. They began reconstructing timelines in precise fragments, forcing Mercer to respond to very specific moments rather than general denials. The strategy was simple: remove ambiguity, trap inconsistencies. "Where were you on August 12, 1998? "I don't remember." "Did you deliver freight through Palm Ridge that week?" "I don't remember." "Do you recognize Melissa Grant?" A pause, longer than before, just long enough for every microphone in the room to catch the silence. Then, "No." But the hesitation changed everything. Outside the room, investigators replayed the moment repeatedly. Frame by frame. Audio filtered. Micro-expressions analyzed. The conclusion was not definitive, but it was unsettling. The denial came too late. And too carefully. Meanwhile, search teams excavated a newly identified property tied to Mercer's former work contracts. An abandoned agricultural lot on the outskirts of Broward County, overgrown with vegetation and partially reclaimed by swamp. Ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies beneath a collapsed shed foundation. Cadaver dogs reacted strongly near a shallow depression in the soil. For the first time since the arrest, investigators felt something shift. Hope and dread arriving together. Excavation began under strict supervision. Floodlights illuminated the site through night and into morning. Every shovel of dirt carried weight far beyond procedure. Reporters were kept at a distance, but drones still captured fragments of what was happening, feeding a public already obsessed with the case. Then the dig stopped. Not because of confirmation, but because of uncertainty. Bone fragments were recovered. Small. Fragmented. Not enough for immediate identification, but enough to trigger full forensic escalation. The lab results would take days. Those days stretched like hours no one wanted to live through. Inside interrogation, Mercer was informed of the discovery. For the first time, he reacted in a visible way. Not shock. Not fear. Not denial. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair and stared at the ceiling for nearly 10 seconds. One detective later described the moment as like watching someone listen to a song only they could hear. When he spoke again, his voice was unchanged. "I don't know anything about that." But the room no longer believed him. That night, Melissa Grant's mother was shown updated forensic reports. She did not speak for several minutes. She only stared at the papers, hands trembling, as if trying to read a language that refused to make sense. Finally, she asked one question. "Is she finally coming home?" No one answered immediately, because investigators understood what the next phase meant. If the remains were confirmed, the case would shift from missing person to confirmed homicide. But even that would not bring closure. Not without Mercer speaking. Not without a location. Not without truth. And Mercer had built his entire defense on one strategy that was proving terrifyingly effective. Silence. The kind of silence that does not crack under pressure. The kind that survives decades. The kind that suggests the answers are not forgotten. They are hidden. Somewhere real. Somewhere deliberate. And as the lab continued its analysis, detectives began to fear the most dangerous possibility of all. That Daniel Mercer was not trying to hide what he had done. He was waiting for them to stop asking the right question. The lab results came back just after dawn, when the building was still half asleep and the fluorescent lights in the forensic wing felt colder than usual. A single email notification changed the entire trajectory of the investigation before most of the team had even finished their first cup of coffee. Human origin confirmed. The bone fragment recovered from the Broward County excavation was not animal. It was human. Female. Age range consistent with Melissa Grant. Partial mitochondrial DNA matched her maternal lineage with a probability that left no meaningful room for doubt. Not certainty in the absolute sense, but in forensic terms, it was as close as modern science could push without a full skeletal recovery. Inside the command center, nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Not celebration, not relief, just a heavy, collective recognition that the case had crossed a line it could never step back from. Melissa Grant was no longer just missing. She was confirmed dead. And somewhere in that silence, the shape of 27 years of unanswered questions suddenly became sharper, more suffocating, more real. The notification spread instantly. Within hours, national news cycles shifted tone. No longer a disappearance story. No longer a cold case mystery. Now it was a confirmed homicide tied to a suspect who had lived unnoticed for decades in plain sight. The phrase Florida cold case returned again, but this time it carried a different weight. Less curiosity, more horror. Inside the interrogation room, Mercer was informed quietly. No dramatic presentation. No confrontation with evidence on a table. Just a detective reading the confirmation aloud in a controlled voice, watching for any fracture in his expression. There was none. Mercer listened, blinked once, and said nothing for nearly 10 seconds. Then he spoke. "I told you I don't know anything." The response was identical to every other denial. But now it felt different. Not uncertain. Not defensive. Just final, like a door locking from the inside. Detectives began adjusting strategy again. The case could no longer rely on persuasion. The assumption shifted toward something more disturbing. If Mercer would not speak voluntarily, then every remaining answer would have to come from evidence alone. And that meant going deeper into his history. Much deeper. A forensic financial analyst reconstructed Mercer's entire employment trail from the early 1990s onward. What emerged was not chaotic or random. It was structured. Deliberate gaps in documentation. Short-term contracts followed by long stretches of independent work. Repeated relocation patterns that formed a loose but consistent geographic loop across northern Florida and southern Georgia. The loop was the most troubling discovery, because it suggested repetition. Not one event. Multiple. At the same time, behavioral analysts re-examined Mercer's psychological profile under the new confirmation of homicide. What had once been categorized as emotional flatness now appeared more calculated. The absence of visible reaction was no longer interpreted as detachment. It was control, a decision, not a condition. Outside, public pressure intensified again. Melissa's name returned to every broadcast, but now it was accompanied by something heavier. Other missing women were suddenly being re-examined in connection to Mercer's movements. Families who had spent decades without answers began receiving calls from investigators asking for DNA samples, old photographs, personal belongings. Hope and dread returned together in the same breath. Inside the sheriff's office, a map was pinned to an entire wall. Red markers tracked Mercer's known locations over time. Blue pins represented confirmed disappearances. Yellow pins marked unsolved cases under review. By the third day after the DNA confirmation, the map no longer looked like scattered data. It looked like a pattern converging toward a single spine of movement. One investigator reportedly stood in front of it for over an hour without speaking, then quietly said, "This isn't a coincidence map. This is a travel record." That night, interrogation resumed with a different tone. Not aggressive. Not persuasive. Clinical. Detectives began presenting Mercer with verified facts only. No speculation. No emotional appeals. Just confirmed data points, dates, routes, recovered evidence, DNA confirmation. Each statement was followed by silence, waiting for contradiction. There was none. Mercer did not correct them. He did not expand. He simply repeated the same phrase when directly asked to connect himself to the locations. "I don't remember." But something had changed in the room dynamic. The certainty that had once belonged entirely to Mercer's silence was starting to erode. Not because he was speaking, but because the evidence no longer needed him to. Then came the storage unit escalation. Investigators obtained a warrant for a second location tied to Mercer through a long-expired lease agreement. This one had been overlooked in earlier searches because records had been misfiled under a different business name. The unit sat in a rural facility outside Jacksonville, abandoned for nearly a decade. When the lock was finally cut and the door rolled open, the air inside carried a stale, metallic dryness that made several officers instinctively pause. What they found was not random. It was organized. Boxes stacked with deliberate spacing. Items categorized in a way that suggested repeated revisiting rather than abandonment. Some containers were labeled with dates. Others with initials. A few had no markings at all. Inside one of the sealed boxes, investigators found newspaper clippings carefully laminated, all reporting missing women across different years. Each article had sections highlighted, specific paragraphs underlined, margins filled with handwritten notes that were mostly illegible but consistent in handwriting style. Another box contained maps. Not tourist maps. Not generic road charts. Detailed regional layouts with hand-drawn annotations marking rural intersections, rest stops, and isolated access roads. But the most disturbing discovery came from a smaller container tucked beneath the rest. Photographs. Dozens of them. Not crime scene images. Not official documentation. Personal photographs taken covertly. Women at gas stations. Women walking alone near roadside diners. Women captured in everyday moments without awareness of being watched. Investigators did not immediately release details to the public, but internally, the implication was clear. Surveillance. Selection. Repetition. The FBI escalated Mercer's classification within hours. What had begun as a single homicide investigation was now being evaluated as a potential multi-state serial pattern spanning over a decade. And yet, Mercer still refused to speak. Back in interrogation, when confronted with the contents of the storage unit, he did not react in any visible way. No denial stronger than before. No anger. No breakdown. Just the same measured stillness. But one detective noticed something subtle. For the first time since questioning began, Mercer was no longer making eye contact with anyone in the room. His gaze stayed fixed slightly downward, as if avoiding something only he could see. The psychological team interpreted it differently. Not avoidance of the detectives. Avoidance of memory. Or guilt. Or recognition. The distinction mattered less than the consequence. Because now, even silence was starting to feel like information. That evening, Melissa Grant's case file was officially updated in federal records. Status changed from active homicide investigation to confirmed victim in serial-linked cold case. Her mother received the notification at home. She did not call anyone. She did not speak. She simply sat in her living room holding the same photograph she had carried for 27 years, while outside her window, the Florida rain began again, soft at first, then steady, like it had never stopped since the night her daughter disappeared. And in a room miles away, Daniel Mercer remained under fluorescent lights, still refusing to answer the only question that now mattered. Where are they? The silence inside the interrogation room had begun to feel structured, almost intentional, like it had a shape that investigators were slowly learning to recognize. By the fifth day, everyone involved understood something unsettling. Daniel Mercer was not breaking, not because the pressure was insufficient, but because pressure itself seemed irrelevant to him now. The usual psychological levers, time distortion, fatigue, confrontation with evidence, had stopped producing any visible response. He sat in the same position for hours at a time, blinking occasionally, breathing evenly, as though the room belonged to someone else entirely. Outside, the case had outgrown the building again. National agencies were now coordinating directly from Washington. The phrase Florida cold case had become shorthand in media circles for something far larger than a single investigation. It was a growing archive of possibility, of victims who might still be unnamed, of roads that had carried Mercer across years without anyone connecting the dots. Inside the command center, the map wall had been updated overnight. New pins had appeared. Not confirmed victims, but high-probability links based on Mercer's reconstructed travel patterns. The cluster around northern Florida had thickened so much that red markers began overlapping, forming dense regions that no longer looked like geography. They looked like accumulation. One senior investigator stood in front of it and said quietly, he wasn't random. He was consistent. That sentence changed the tone of every conversation that followed. Consistency implied structure. Structure implied intent. Intent implied planning. And planning implied awareness over time. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued processing the contents of the Jacksonville storage unit. Each box revealed another layer, not of new evidence in the traditional sense, but of behavior repeated over years. The newspapers weren't just collected, they were curated. The maps weren't just marked, they were revised, as though Mercer had returned to them repeatedly, refining something invisible. One analyst noted that certain routes appeared emphasized more than others, circled multiple times in different ink colors. When compared with Mercer's known employment history, those routes corresponded with specific years where multiple women had gone missing in adjacent counties. Still, nothing directly tied him to a single act beyond the confirmed DNA fragment. And that remained the legal tension point. Evidence was growing, but narrative still required anchors. Inside interrogation, detectives shifted again. This time, they tried absence instead of pressure. Long pauses, extended silence, allowing Mercer to fill gaps that never came. Hours passed with almost no dialogue. The strategy was based on a simple idea. Sometimes suspects speak to break discomfort. Mercer did not. He simply existed in the space. At one point, a junior detective placed a series of photographs on the table. Not graphic, not explicit, just recovered images of missing women whose cases were now being reviewed for connection. Faces, names, dates, each one carefully arranged in chronological order. Mercer looked at them, not quickly, not with shock, but with a slow, deliberate attention that lasted several seconds longer than expected. Then he leaned back slightly and said, "I don't know them." It was the first time he had used the plural. Detectives immediately noticed the shift. Not in content, but in structure. The statement acknowledged the existence of multiple subjects in a way his previous denials had not. It was subtle, but in interrogation work, subtle changes often matter more than overt admissions. Still, no confession followed. No deviation from his core narrative. "I don't remember. I don't know. I didn't do anything." Repetition that resisted erosion. Outside, pressure was escalating in another direction entirely. Families of other missing women began organizing publicly, demanding transparency from law enforcement about whether their loved ones might be connected to Mercer. Some had waited decades for answers. Now they were being told there might finally be a framework to understand their loss, but not yet the closure. The emotional weight of that uncertainty spread through Florida in waves. Vigils were held in multiple counties simultaneously. Candles lined sidewalks. Photographs were displayed on courthouse steps. Names were spoken aloud into humid night air that felt heavier than usual. And every speech ended the same way. Bring them home. Back in the investigation, a new forensic development shifted attention again. Analysts working on the storage unit evidence identified trace residues on the interior lining of one of the boxes. Microscopic fibers consistent with synthetic rope material, the type commonly used in transportation securing systems during long-haul freight deliveries in the 1990s. Mercer's former employment suddenly became more than context. It became infrastructure. Investigators began reconstructing what Mercer's delivery environment would have looked like in operational detail. Truck configurations, cargo types, overnight parking habits, route timing. The goal was no longer just identifying victims, but understanding opportunity windows, where, when, and how access occurred. The model they built was unsettling in its simplicity. Isolated stops, predictable delays, unmonitored rural stretches, each one a potential intersection between routine logistics and unseen violence. Yet still, Mercer remained silent. Then came the psychological pivot that no one had fully anticipated. During a routine break in interrogation, when Mercer was left alone in the room under observation, he began speaking quietly to himself. Not loudly enough for transcripts to immediately capture, but enough for audio engineers reviewing the feed to notice irregularities. At first it sounded like fragmented phrases. Then patterns emerged. Names were not clearly distinguishable, but rhythms of speech suggested repetition tied to memory recall rather than random muttering. Analysts replayed the audio multiple times, enhancing frequencies, isolating background noise. One phrase became partially audible. That the road doesn't end there. Investigators froze when they heard it, because none of them had mentioned roads in the last session. The statement suggested internal referencing, a mental map not dependent on external prompts, something stored, structured, and accessible. The interrogation strategy changed immediately. Next session, detectives introduced maps again. But this time, not of confirmed routes or known cases. Instead, they laid out blank regional layouts and asked Mercer to identify familiar areas. He did not respond verbally, but his eyes moved. Subtle shifts, micro-adjustments, tracking. When a specific region near coastal marshland was placed on the table, Mercer's gaze lingered slightly longer than before. Not long enough to be conclusive, but long enough to be recorded. The FBI analyst watching from behind glass quietly wrote one word in his notes. Retention. Meaning memory was not absent. It was contained. That realization reframed everything. Because if Mercer retained memory, then silence was not confusion. It was choice. That night, investigators expanded search parameters again. New excavation zones were marked based on Mercer's delivery routes combined with environmental conditions favorable to concealment. Marshlands, abandoned industrial outskirts, old logging roads, places where soil composition, water tables, and vegetation density could naturally obscure disturbances over decades. Teams prepared for weeks of fieldwork. And still, no one expected immediate results. But the next morning, one of the cadaver dogs assigned to a remote marsh site outside Cedar County alerted persistently at a specific patch of ground near a collapsed drainage ditch. Digging began cautiously, slowly, then faster. Within hours, fragments appeared again. Not complete remains, but enough to confirm human association. This time, investigators did not wait for full lab confirmation before briefing command, because the pattern was becoming too consistent to ignore. Multiple sites, multiple fragments, multiple decades, and all roads, in some form, converging back toward a single moving point in time. Daniel Mercer. When informed of the new discovery, Mercer did not change posture. But something in the room shifted. Detectives felt it before they saw it. A tightening of attention. Not outward. Inward. As though something had been touched that should not have been. He finally spoke without being asked a question. It doesn't matter. 3 words. First deviation from denial structure in days. When pressed, he did not elaborate. He simply repeated the phrase once more. It doesn't matter. And then fell silent again. But for the first time in the entire investigation, silence no longer felt empty. It felt loaded, like something inside it had finally begun to move. The words, "it doesn't matter," didn't leave the room the way normal statements did. They lingered. They echoed in a way that felt disproportionate to their length, like they had been spoken with intention rather than reflex. Every investigator present replayed them internally, searching for context, tone, hidden meaning. But Mercer offered nothing else. He returned immediately to silence, posture unchanged, gaze lowered again, as if the brief rupture had never happened. Outside the interrogation room, the phrase spread through the building like a fault line. Analysts flagged it. Behavioral specialists highlighted it. Prosecutors circled it in red on printed transcripts. Because in cases like this, when a suspect breaks pattern even slightly, it rarely happens by accident. It usually signals either psychological collapse or controlled communication. And Mercer was not collapsing. He was composed, which meant the statement had weight. The investigation, already expanding across multiple counties, now shifted again in tone. What had been a search for physical evidence became something closer to mapping intent. Detectives were no longer only asking what happened to Melissa Grant. They were asking whether Mercer had been building a system of behavior that extended beyond any single victim. Operation Lantern was officially upgraded to a multi-jurisdictional serial linkage task force. That designation changed everything. Case files that had once been separate were merged into unified timelines. Missing persons reports from the early 1990s were reprocessed with modern geographic profiling tools. Algorithms compared Mercer's confirmed travel history against unsolved disappearances with a level of precision unavailable during the original investigations. The results were not vague. They were aligned. Clusters formed along specific highway corridors, rural intersections that Mercer would have passed repeatedly during overnight deliveries. Small towns that, on paper, seemed unremarkable but now appeared repeatedly inside overlapping datasets. One analyst described it in a briefing as a shadow highway system, parallel to commercial routes but defined by absence. Absence of witnesses. Absence of surveillance. Absence of recovery. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued excavations at newly identified sites. Each location carried the same pattern: remote, transitional, overlooked. Places where infrastructure ended and visibility dropped. Drainage zones. Logging cutoffs. Abandoned service roads reclaimed by vegetation. At one site near northern wetlands, soil stratification suggested a disturbance dating back decades. Cadaver dogs reacted strongly before digging even began. When excavation finally broke through the upper layer, investigators found textile fragments embedded deep in sediment. Degraded, but consistent with clothing fibers from the late 1990s. No full remains were recovered at that site yet, but the reaction alone was enough to escalate urgency. Inside interrogation, Mercer was informed of the widening scope. This time, detectives did not show him photographs. They did not present maps. Instead, they spoke in sequences. Dates, locations, recovered fragments. Each statement delivered slowly, deliberately, with pauses in between. Mercer listened without interruption. No visible reaction. But when one specific county name was mentioned, Bryan County, his fingers shifted slightly on the edge of the table. A minor movement, almost imperceptible, but recorded immediately by the observation camera system. It was the first involuntary physical response in days. Still, he said nothing. The psychological team debated intensely after the session. Some believed Mercer was dissociating. Others argued he was maintaining strict cognitive control, selectively allowing minimal leakage of reaction to avoid full disclosure under interrogation pressure. A third theory emerged from a senior FBI profiler that unsettled everyone in the room. He may not be protecting himself, she said. He may be protecting structure. The idea was that Mercer's silence was not defensive in the traditional sense. It was organizational, as if disclosure of one detail might collapse a larger internal framework he had maintained for decades. If true, it meant answers existed, but they were compartmentalized, not lost, contained. That interpretation changed the direction of questioning again. Instead of focusing on what Mercer did, investigators began probing how he navigated space. Routes, stops, timing, behavior during transit. They reconstructed delivery schedules hour by hour, attempting to identify behavioral gaps where deviation might have occurred. And then something unexpected appeared. A discrepancy. Between two verified shipment logs from 1998, there was a 6-hour period where Mercer's documented route did not align with GPS-equivalent reconstruction models derived from fuel receipts and toll records. That gap had been overlooked for years because earlier investigators assumed documentation errors. Now it looked different. It looked intentional. 6 hours without accounting. 6 hours where Mercer could have been anywhere. When confronted with the gap, Mercer responded for the first time with something other than denial or dismissal. I drove. That was it. No elaboration. No clarification. But the room changed again. Because it was the first statement that acknowledged action rather than memory failure. Detectives pressed immediately. Where did you drive? Mercer looked at them for a long moment. Long enough that even seasoned investigators felt the pressure shift. Then he said, same roads. It was not an answer. But it was not nothing. Outside, the forensic excavation at the Northern Wetlands site reached a critical stage. A second cluster of fragments was discovered deeper in the soil matrix. Analysis suggested multiple deposition events over time rather than a single occurrence. That detail alone forced investigators to reconsider the timeline entirely. Not one event. Possibly more. Possibly repeated. News coverage escalated again, framing the investigation in increasingly stark terms. Headlines referenced patterned disappearances, multi-site evidence, and decades-long concealment network. Families of missing women began arriving at command centers in person, holding photographs, asking if their loved ones were part of the emerging pattern. There were no answers yet, only expanding possibility. Inside interrogation, exhaustion began to surface, not in Mercer, but in the room itself. Detectives rotated more frequently. Tension increased. Coffee cups accumulated. Transcripts grew longer, but less conclusive. The sense of control that once defined interrogation strategy was eroding, and Mercer remained the only constant. Still, quiet, contained. Then, during a late-night session, something shifted again. A junior detective, reviewing older case files aloud, mentioned a missing woman from 2001 whose disappearance occurred near one of Mercer's documented overnight rest stops. The detective did not expect a reaction. It was routine cross-referencing. But Mercer looked up, directly, for the first time in hours. Not toward the papers, toward the detective speaking. And he said something that froze the room. She got out. Silence hit immediately. No one spoke. Even the recording equipment seemed louder in the sudden stillness. The detective asked him to repeat it. Mercer did not. Instead, he returned to silence instantly, as if the phrase had not been meant for them, or perhaps not meant to exist outside his control. But the damage was done. Because she got out implied awareness. It implied sequence. It implied memory of outcome. And more importantly, It implied that Mercer was not describing absence. He was describing events. The interrogation room was no longer just a place of questioning. It had become a containment zone for information that was slowly leaking in controlled fragments. And somewhere in that structure, investigators realized something fundamental. They were not pulling truth out of Mercer. They were waiting for Mercer to decide what part of truth could surface next. By the time Part 7 of the investigation unfolded, the case no longer felt like a straight line moving toward resolution. It felt like a widening spiral, pulling every new discovery back toward a center that remained deliberately hidden. The phrase Mercer had spoken, "She got out," refused to leave the minds of the interrogation team. It wasn't just its content. It was the way it had been delivered. Not defensive, not emotional, almost observational, like a fact recorded rather than revealed. That distinction became the focus of every discussion afterward. Inside the Federal Task Force briefing room, analysts replayed the moment repeatedly, isolating audio, examining micropauses, mapping eye movement. The conclusion was not unified, but it leaned toward one unsettling possibility. Mercer was not improvising answers. He was selecting from a structured internal record. And that meant the story they were trying to extract from him already existed somewhere inside his mind in an organized form. Outside, Florida's investigative apparatus continued expanding. New search zones were activated based on refined behavioral modeling. Instead of simply following Mercer's known routes, analysts began projecting decision points, locations where a driver with his pattern might deviate without raising suspicion. Truck stops with limited surveillance. Rural intersections with multiple exit paths. Service roads branching into wetlands or abandoned industrial land. Each point represented a theoretical opportunity window, and each window was now treated as potentially significant. At one such site, west of a decommissioned rail corridor, excavation teams uncovered something that immediately shifted the tone of field operations. Not remains this time, but an object, a weathered personal item partially embedded in soil near an old drainage trench. It was degraded beyond easy identification, but forensic imaging confirmed it had been present in the environment for decades. It was cataloged and rushed to lab analysis. No immediate conclusions were released. But within hours, the atmosphere around the task force changed again. Not because of certainty, but because of accumulation. One fragment could be dismissed. Two could be coincidence. But repeated findings across geographically linked zones began forming a pattern too stable to ignore. Inside interrogation, Mercer was brought in again shortly after sunrise. This time, the room setup had changed. No photographs. No maps on the table. Only a single screen showing a timeline reconstruction of his known movements between 1994 and 2002. He watched it without expression. Detectives began at the earliest confirmed point and moved forward slowly, narrating his life in structured increments. 1994, Jacksonville delivery contract begins. No reaction. 1996, extended regional routes through northern Florida. No reaction. 1998, Palm Ridge corridor activity confirmed. A pause. Slight. Barely measurable. But enough for the lead investigator to stop speaking. Mercer's eyes did not shift away from the screen, but his breathing changed subtly. Not faster. Not deeper. Just different in rhythm. Then, without being prompted, he spoke. "You're looking in the wrong order." The sentence landed like a disruption in a controlled system. Detectives immediately asked him to clarify. Mercer did not respond for several seconds. Then he leaned back slightly, still avoiding direct eye contact. "It doesn't start where you think it starts." That was the second time he had used variation around the same phrase. It doesn't matter earlier, now, it doesn't start where you think it starts. Each statement suggested structure outside the investigative framework. Not denial. Redirection. The behavioral team watching through observation glass became visibly more alert. One profiler quietly noted that Mercer was beginning to reference narrative sequencing rather than isolated events. That was significant. It implied cognitive organization of memory into a timeline he controlled internally. And control, in interrogation dynamics, often meant hierarchy. Something had order. Something had sequence. But not the one investigators were using. Outside, the latest lab analysis returned from the rail corridor site. The object recovered was confirmed to be consistent with personal effects manufactured in the late 1990s. While it could not be directly linked to Melissa Grant or any confirmed victim, Its presence reinforced a troubling pattern: repeated deposition of human-associated items across multiple environments tied to Mercer's travel history. The investigative map was updated again. More pins, more overlaps, less empty space. Families of missing women were now gathered outside the courthouse almost daily. Some held signs demanding answers. Others simply stood in silence. The case had become larger than any single disappearance. It had become a collective grief that was no longer separated by years or counties. Inside Mercer's interrogation, pressure was now being applied differently. Instead of confrontation, investigators began controlled narrative reconstruction. They presented Mercer with partial timelines and asked him to fill gaps, not with confession, but with continuity. After leaving Jacksonville in 1998, where did you go next? I drove. Which route? The usual. Define usual. A pause. Longer this time. Then, the roads that don't get watched. That sentence changed the room temperature in a way no one could ignore, because it implied intentional selection of low-surveillance environments. Not randomness. Not convenience. Selection. Detectives did not push immediately. They allowed silence to build again, hoping he might continue. He did not. But later that night, when Mercer was alone under observation, audio capture picked up faint speech again. Fragmented, low, almost inaudible. That they stopped looking after a while. That time does the rest. Forensic linguists reviewed the recording for hours. The interpretation was cautious but chilling. The phrases suggested awareness of investigative decay, how attention fades over time, how cases cool, how evidence becomes static. If accurate, it meant Mercer understood the life cycle of investigations, and potentially operated within it. The next morning, the task force received an unexpected development from an unrelated county archive. A retired dispatcher reviewing old handwritten logs noticed a recurring identifier in Mercer's historical freight assignments. Not a name, a routing code, one that appeared disproportionately during periods aligned with missing persons cases. When cross-referenced, the code matched a defunct logistics classification used for flexible overnight deliveries, routes without fixed checkpoints, routes designed for minimal tracking, routes that, in hindsight, may have provided ideal conditions for unseen movement. The discovery was not definitive evidence, but it added another structural layer to the emerging pattern. Inside interrogation, Mercer was shown none of this. Instead, detectives shifted again to a more direct question. Why do you keep saying you don't remember? For the first time, Mercer's response was slower than usual. Not immediate. Not rehearsed. Then he said, because remembering is not the same as telling. That line did not belong to denial. It belonged to boundary setting, a distinction between internal knowledge and external disclosure. And it suggested that Mercer's silence was not absence of information. It was selective containment. Outside, excavation teams continued expanding search grids into newly identified marsh sectors. Drone mapping revealed terrain anomalies consistent with long-term ground disturbance in areas previously considered inaccessible. Cadaver dogs were redeployed across multiple counties simultaneously. The scope of the investigation now resembled something far beyond a single case file. It was becoming a landscape reconstruction project spanning decades. And at the center of it all, Daniel Mercer remained in the same chair, speaking only in fragments, shaping responses like someone carefully deciding how much of a sealed structure could safely be opened without collapsing it entirely. But investigators were beginning to understand something crucial. The truth was not hidden in what Mercer refused to say. It was hidden in what he chose to say just barely enough of. And every fragment was leading them closer to a map they had not yet fully drawn. By the 8th phase of the investigation, the case had stopped behaving like a collection of incidents and started resembling something closer to a system, interconnected, layered, and deliberately resistant to full visibility. The phrase Mercer had spoken days earlier, "You're looking in the wrong order," had been dissected endlessly by analysts. At first it was dismissed as deflection, a psychological tactic to disrupt questioning flow. But the more investigators reconstructed his timeline, the more that statement began to feel less like evasion and more like instruction. A warning disguised as structure. Inside the Federal Task Force Command Center, the evidence wall had been completely reorganized overnight. The previous linear timeline was gone. In its place was a branching model, nodes representing Mercer's verified locations, connected not chronologically, but geographically and behaviorally. The result looked less like a timeline and more like a web stretched across northern Florida and southern Georgia. Every node had associated metadata: fuel stops, delivery logs, confirmed sightings, missing persons reports, environmental conditions. And in the center of it all, repeated again and again, were empty spaces. Gaps. Unaccounted intervals that refused to align neatly with any official documentation. Those gaps were now the primary focus. Not the confirmed events. The missing time. Inside interrogation, Mercer was brought in under a new strategy. The goal was no longer confrontation or pressure. It was reconstruction through omission. Investigators began reading him segments of his own timeline, but intentionally leaving out certain intervals to observe whether he would correct them. It was a controlled experiment in narrative integrity. June 1997, Jacksonville route completed. August 1997, regional delivery expansion confirmed. Mercer listened. No reaction. October 1997, continued operations through Northern Corridor. Still nothing. Then the investigator paused deliberately, skipping a known gap. A blank. A deliberate omission. That was the moment Mercer shifted slightly in his chair. Not much, but enough. A fraction of movement in posture. A tightening in the jaw. Then he spoke quietly. "You skipped it." The room went still. The investigator asked him to clarify. Mercer did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes lifted briefly toward the screen showing his reconstructed timeline. Then he said, "That's where it happens." No elaboration followed. No explanation. But the implication landed immediately and heavily. Investigators froze the feed and replayed the exchange multiple times. Behavioral analysts began marking that moment as a critical inflection point. For the first time, Mercer had acknowledged not just events, but structure. Not just memory, but segmentation. There is a location in time he refuses to bypass, one profiler noted. That suggests anchoring, something he is protecting cognitively. Outside the interrogation room, forensic teams were already reprocessing all known gaps in Mercer's employment history. What they found was alarming in its consistency. The missing intervals were not random. They often aligned with transitions between contracts, times when Mercer had maximum mobility and minimal oversight. Periods where he would have been entirely unmonitored. One analyst quietly referred to them as dark windows. Inside those windows, investigators began overlaying missing persons reports with environmental data, weather conditions, traffic density, road construction records, satellite imagery archives. The goal was to reconstruct what could have happened in spaces where documentation did not exist. The result was not proof, but it was convergence. Several disappearances aligned suspiciously with those exact windows, and each alignment increased the pressure inside the task force. Meanwhile, excavation efforts intensified at multiple newly identified sites. One location near an abandoned agricultural processing facility produced another partial recovery. Bone fragments buried beneath layers of sediment consistent with seasonal flooding over decades. Forensic geologists confirmed that the site had remained undisturbed since the early 2000s. It was not enough for identification, but it was enough to expand the victim radius. And that expansion changed everything again. Because now Mercer was no longer being evaluated as a suspect tied to one confirmed victim, or even a small cluster. He was being evaluated as a potential long-term serial offender operating across environmental zones that naturally erased evidence over time. Inside interrogation, Mercer was shown none of this expansion. Instead, detectives returned to the idea of the dark window. This time directly. What happens in the gap between October and November 1997? Mercer stared at the table for several seconds, long enough that the recording system captured the silence as a measurable interval. Then he said, "Nothing you can prove." The answer was not denial. It was constraint. A boundary placed deliberately between knowledge and admissibility. And it made investigators rethink everything again. Because Mercer was no longer simply refusing to confess. He was actively defining the limits of what could be known through evidence alone. That realization created tension inside the room. Not frustration, but something closer to recognition of scale. As if they were dealing not with gaps in memory, but with intentionally structured absence. Outside, media coverage intensified further after leaked reports confirmed multiple additional excavation sites tied to Mercer's historical routes. Headlines no longer referred to a single case. They spoke in plural terms: Florida Cold Case Network, multi-site disappearance pattern, decades of unanswered vanishings. Families of missing women began arriving at command centers with increased frequency. Some brought belongings for DNA comparison. Others brought nothing but photographs and questions they had carried for decades without relief. The emotional atmosphere around the investigation had become unstable. Hope and dread arrived simultaneously with every update. Inside Mercer's interrogation, a new approach was introduced. Rather than asking about events, detectives asked about decisions. Why those routes? Mercer did not respond immediately. The question remained hanging longer than usual. Then he said, "Because they were quiet." A pause. Then another sentence, almost softer. "Quiet is easier." It was the closest thing to reasoning he had offered. Not confession, not admission, but preference, a selection criterion. Behavioral analysts immediately flagged the statement as significant. It indicated environmental selection based on predictability and isolation, key components in profiling serial mobility patterns. But still, Mercer gave nothing concrete. No locations, no victims, no confirmations, only structure, always structure. That night, during off-record review, investigators noticed something else in Mercer's earlier statements that had been overlooked. When he said, "That's where it happens," his tone had not suggested singularity. It had suggested repetition, as if it was not one event, but a category of events occurring within a specific framework. That interpretation led to an immediate reevaluation of all known gaps. And what emerged was even more disturbing. Several dark windows did not correspond to isolated disappearances. They overlapped. Multiple cases, different counties, same time frames. It suggested parallel occurrences within the same behavioral cycles. The implication was staggering. If correct, Mercer was not linked to a sequence of individual incidents. He was linked to clusters. Inside interrogation, when confronted again, Mercer showed the first sign of visible fatigue. Not emotional, but cognitive. A brief delay in response. A longer blink. A moment where his composure did not break, but softened slightly under accumulated pressure. Detectives noticed immediately. They pressed carefully. "You said there's a place where it happens. What is it?" Mercer did not answer at first. Then quietly, "You don't get there by asking." Silence followed. Heavy. Deliberate. And in that silence, investigators realized something that shifted the entire trajectory of the case again. They were not being denied information. They were being excluded from a framework. A structure Mercer understood completely, and one he had no intention of fully translating into their language. By the 9th phase of the investigation, the case had stopped feeling like something being solved and started feeling like something being slowly revealed on its own terms. The task force had expanded to include behavioral analysts, forensic geologists, digital reconstruction teams, and retired cold case specialists pulled back into service. Every layer of expertise now fed into a single goal: reconstruct the structure Mercer kept circling but never fully naming. Inside the command center, the dark windows had become the primary operational focus. What had once been dismissed as missing documentation gaps were now treated as intentional zones of untraceable movement. Each window was mapped, cross-referenced, and overlaid with environmental conditions that could have facilitated concealment. And a pattern began to emerge that no one was comfortable naming aloud. The windows were not random. They clustered, not just in time, but in geography. Certain counties repeatedly aligned with Mercer's unmonitored intervals. Certain rural corridors appeared again and again across different years, like threads pulled through different layers of the same fabric. One analyst finally broke the silence during a briefing. "This isn't just mobility," he said. "It's repetition of access points." Inside interrogation, Mercer was brought in under a revised strategy once again. The goal had shifted away from extracting confession entirely. Instead, investigators now focused on eliciting structure confirmation, testing whether Mercer would acknowledge the existence of patterns without directly admitting to actions. They began carefully. Controlled phrasing. Neutral language. No emotional framing. "During your time operating routes in northern Florida, did you frequently use the same access roads?" Mercer looked at the table, then replied, "Yes." A single word. But it was the first explicit confirmation of repeated spatial behavior. The room changed instantly. Not in volume, but in attention. Detectives leaned forward slightly. The behavioral team behind glass became still. Because Mercer had crossed a threshold he had avoided for days. Acknowledgement of repetition. The next question followed immediately. Why those roads? Mercer paused, long enough for the recorder to register silence as structured absence. Then, they don't change. That answer reframed everything again. Not preference. Not coincidence. Stability. Investigators later debated whether the statement was logistical or psychological, but the implication remained the same. Mercer selected environments based on predictability and lack of variability. And predictability, in investigative terms, meant control. Outside the interrogation room, forensic teams were now focusing on reconstructing environmental conditions rather than just routes. Satellite archives from the late 1990s were reprocessed to identify road visibility, vegetation density, and surveillance absence across Mercer's travel zones. What they discovered added another layer of unsettling clarity. Many of the areas associated with missing persons during Mercer's operational years shared a common trait: transitional infrastructure, roads under construction, rural intersections without lighting, temporary detours that redirected traffic into less monitored corridors. It wasn't just isolation. It was engineered ambiguity in movement pathways. Inside the task force, one senior investigator described it as working inside blind corridors of the transportation system. Meanwhile, new excavation results came in from a site near a collapsed service depot west of Cedar County. This time, recovery was more substantial. Multiple bone fragments were found in close proximity, along with trace evidence suggesting more than one deposition layer. Forensic anthropology confirmed that the remains represented at least two separate individuals. The discovery sent a ripple through the entire command structure. Two. Not one. Not isolated. Multiple. And still unaccounted for in official records. Melissa Grant remained the confirmed anchor case, but now she was no longer the only confirmed victim tied to Mercer's pattern of movement. Inside interrogation, Mercer was informed of the multi-individual recovery. For the first time, there was a pause longer than anything previously recorded. Not dramatic, but sustained. His eyes remained lowered, but his breathing shifted slightly, as if recalibrating internally. Then he spoke. "You're getting closer." The statement was immediately flagged. Investigators asked him to clarify. Mercer did not respond directly. Instead, he added, "But you're still outside it." That phrase caused immediate debate in the observation room, because it implied positional awareness. Not just of events, but of perspective. Mercer was distinguishing between proximity and understanding. He was suggesting that investigators were approaching the structure from outside its boundaries, and that what they were seeing was only the perimeter, not the center. The interrogation strategy shifted again. This time, detectives introduced a full geographic reconstruction model projected onto the wall. It displayed Mercer's confirmed routes, missing time windows, known disappearances, and environmental overlays all in one integrated system. They asked him to identify what the model represented. Mercer studied it for several seconds, longer than usual, then said, "It's missing layers." That was all, but it was enough to trigger immediate recalibration of the model itself. If Mercer's statement was accurate, then investigators were not looking at a complete system. They were looking at a flattened version of something multidimensional in behavior and structure. The implication was deeply unsettling, because it suggested Mercer understood the investigation as incomplete not because of missing data, but because of missing conceptual framing. Outside, public pressure intensified again as news of multiple remains spread. Media outlets began referring to the case as potentially one of the largest serial-linked investigations in Florida history, though officials refused to confirm any classification. Families of missing women now arrived in larger groups. Some sat outside the courthouse holding candles. Others waited silently, refusing interviews, simply hoping for confirmation one way or another. The emotional weight of accumulated uncertainty was becoming visible in every layer of public response. Inside Mercer's interrogation, fatigue was now more visible, but still controlled. His responses were slower, but not inconsistent. His silence was still structured. Even exhaustion seemed organized. Detectives adjusted their approach one final time. They stopped asking about actions. They stopped asking about locations. They asked about sequence. Is there an order to what happened? Mercer looked up for the first time in a long stretch. not fully at the detectives, but slightly above them, as if addressing something behind or beyond the room itself. Then he said, "Everything has order." A pause. Then, "But not yours." The statement landed with unusual force, because it suggested not denial, but alternate framework. Mercer was not rejecting structure. He was asserting the existence of a different one that did not align with investigative reconstruction, one that likely existed entirely independent of how law enforcement was interpreting the case. After that moment, Mercer fell silent again. But something had changed. The interrogation was no longer about extracting truth. It had become about aligning frameworks. And at the center of it, investigators began to realize a disturbing possibility. Mercer was not confused. He was consistent. It was the investigation that was fragmented. And somewhere in that fragmentation, the full shape of what happened still remained just out of reach. By the 10th phase of the investigation, the structure of the case had begun to feel less like a puzzle and more like a sealed system gradually losing pressure at its edges. Mercer's final statement, "Everything has order, but not yours," had become a reference point for every analytical discussion. It wasn't just cryptic phrasing anymore. It was treated as a hypothesis that the investigative framework itself was misaligned with how events were actually organized in Mercer's mind and movements. Inside the command center, the evidence wall had evolved again. What was once a geographic web was now layered into temporal strata. Each layer represented a different year of Mercer's operational history, reconstructed through employment logs, fuel data, known sightings, and newly confirmed forensic sites. When stacked vertically, the patterns became more disturbing. Certain corridors of movement repeated across multiple years with minimal deviation. Specific rural intersections appeared not as isolated points, but as recurring nodes in different temporal layers, suggesting deliberate reuse of environmental conditions over time. One analyst quietly referred to them as return points. Not because Mercer returned emotionally, but because the system he operated within did. Inside interrogation, Mercer was brought in under unusually low stimulation conditions. No photographs, no projected timelines, no maps, just a table, 2 chairs, and the recorded case file summary being read aloud in segments. The strategy was simplicity: reduce external cues, observe internal leakage. The investigator began reading. 1996 to 1998, Northern Florida delivery routes expanded. Multiple unsupervised overnight stops confirmed. Mercer listened without visible change. 1998 to 2001, regional contract mobility increased. Gaps in documentation identified. Still no reaction. Then the investigator paused deliberately. During this period, multiple missing persons cases occurred within proximity of your known routes. That was the first deviation point. Mercer's fingers shifted slightly against the table surface. Not withdrawal. Not tension. Adjustment. Then he spoke. "You keep calling them proximity." The investigator did not respond immediately. Mercer continued, quietly. "That's not how it works." That sentence again reframed the case dynamic. Not denial of connection. Rejection of investigative language itself. Behavioral analysts observing from behind glass immediately marked the moment. Mercer was no longer just controlling information. He was challenging the conceptual tools used to interpret it, which meant the gap between his framework and theirs was widening, not narrowing. Outside the interrogation room, forensic updates arrived from 3 separate excavation sites almost simultaneously. At the Cedar County site, additional remains confirmed a second victim profile. At the Northern Wetlands site, textile fragments were matched to manufacturing batches from the late 1990s, consistent with multiple separate clothing sources. At a third location near an abandoned service road, ground disturbance analysis suggested repeated soil disruption events over different years rather than a single burial incident. The implication was no longer theoretical. It was structural. Multiple incidents across multiple years, tied to overlapping geographic corridors. Inside the task force, tension shifted from investigation to interpretation crisis. One senior profiler summarized it bluntly during briefing. "We are no longer asking if there is a pattern. We are asking what kind of system produces this pattern." Back in interrogation, Mercer was shown none of the new excavation data. Instead, detectives returned to sequencing. This time more precise. Between 1998 and 2001, How many times did you travel through the Bryer County corridor? Mercer did not answer immediately. When he did, it was not a number. It doesn't matter how many. The investigator pressed. Why doesn't it matter? Mercer finally looked up, not directly at the investigator, slightly past them, as if addressing the structure of the question itself rather than its speaker. Because you're counting the wrong thing. That response triggered immediate recalibration in the observation room. Counting the wrong thing implied that the investigative metric, frequency, was irrelevant. That meant the actual variable of importance lay elsewhere. Not how often, but under what conditions, or within what framework. The psychological team began reanalyzing Mercer's earlier statements through this lens. Patterns emerged that had previously been dismissed as evasive repetition. Roads that don't get watched. They don't change. You don't get there by asking. Each phrase now appeared to describe constraints rather than actions. Environmental constraints. Procedural constraints. Perceptual constraints. Mercer was not describing events. He was describing a system with rules. And investigators were not yet operating inside those rules. Outside, public attention reached another peak after partial confirmation of multiple victim profiles. Media coverage shifted from case reporting to structural speculation, with commentators discussing whether Mercer represented an isolated actor or part of a broader behavioral anomaly that exploited systemic blind spots in late 20th century logistics networks. Families of missing women were now being asked to submit DNA profiles at unprecedented scale. Identification labs worked around the clock. Cold storage facilities were expanded temporarily to handle incoming remains from multiple excavation sites. The emotional strain on communities across Florida was now measurable. But inside Mercer's interrogation, emotional framing no longer seemed relevant. Because Mercer was not responding to emotion at all. He was responding to structure. During a late session, investigators introduced a final experimental approach. Instead of asking Mercer about events, they presented him with reconstructed decision points derived from his known travel data. At each point, they asked a single question. Why stop here? Mercer studied the sequence for a long time. Long enough that even seasoned investigators began to suspect he would not respond. Then he spoke. You're asking like there's only one reason. The investigator asked him to explain. Mercer shook his head slightly. There isn't. Silence followed. Then he added, there's timing. There's distance. There's quiet. There's what gets ignored. Each phrase was delivered without emphasis, but together they formed something coherent. Not confession. Not denial. A taxonomy. A classification system for decision environments. Behavioral analysts immediately recognized the shift. Mercer was no longer resisting interrogation. He was describing operational logic, which meant every answer he gave was potentially a fragment of a larger internal model. One that investigators were only beginning to approximate. After the session ended, the task force held an emergency analysis meeting. The conclusion emerging across multiple disciplines was increasingly aligned. Mercer was not improvising explanations. He was referencing a structured internal map of behavior that had governed his movements for years. And every attempt to interrogate him using conventional narrative sequencing was inherently insufficient. Because his framework did not prioritize narrative. It prioritized conditions. That realization reframed the entire investigation. If correct, it meant the path to understanding Mercer did not lie in asking what happened, but in reconstructing the conditions under which he believed certain outcomes were possible. And somewhere inside that shift, investigators began to understand something unsettling. They were not uncovering a story. They were trying to reverse engineer a system that had been operating quietly across decades, invisible not because it was hidden, but because it was distributed across ordinary space, ordinary time, and ordinary movement. And Mercer, still sitting under fluorescent light, remained the only person who appeared to understand all of it at once. By the 11th phase of the investigation, the case no longer felt like it belonged entirely to law enforcement. It had expanded into something closer to a collective reconstruction effort, part forensic science, part behavioral archaeology, part map of absence. The task force had stopped asking whether Mercer's actions were isolated incidents. That question had already collapsed under the weight of accumulated evidence. Instead, they were now focused on something far more unsettling, whether there was a consistent operating logic behind everything he had done. Inside the command center, The layered reconstruction model had become so dense that analysts had begun color-coding not by time or geography, but by behavioral condition, isolation density, surveillance absence, route predictability, and environmental transition zones. When viewed as a whole, the model no longer resembled a map. It resembled a filter. Certain spaces consistently allowed activity to pass through unnoticed, while others acted as barriers. Mercer's entire movement history seemed to cluster around those permeable zones. One analyst finally summarized it in a briefing that went unchallenged because no one had a better explanation. He didn't operate in places, she said. He operated in conditions where detection was unlikely. That distinction changed everything again. Inside interrogation, Mercer was brought in later than usual. The lighting in the room had been adjusted slightly, softer at the edges, less harsh directly overhead. It was a minor procedural change, but it reflected the evolving strategy. Investigators were no longer trying to break him. They were trying to align with his framework. The lead investigator began carefully. "We are not asking you to confess." Mercer did not react. "We are asking you to clarify structure." That word, structure, seemed to register differently. Not emotionally, but cognitively. A small pause followed. Then Mercer said, "You're finally asking the right direction." It was not approval. It was acknowledgement of orientation. The room tightened immediately. The investigator continued. "You said there are conditions. Define them." Mercer looked down at his hands for a moment, then spoke slowly. "Distance from oversight." A pause. Time between checks. Another pause. And routes that repeat without being remembered. Each phrase landed like a piece of code being revealed incrementally. Behavioral analysts behind the glass began writing rapidly. Not because it was new information in isolation, but because it confirmed a hypothesis they had been circling for days. Mercer was describing a system where visibility decay over time was a functional variable, not a consequence. In simpler terms, the longer something went unobserved, the more stable it became within his operational model. Outside the interrogation room, new forensic updates arrived from multiple sites almost simultaneously again. At a marsh excavation zone previously flagged as low probability, cadaver dogs indicated a second subsurface anomaly. At a rural drainage corridor, partial remains were recovered in a stratified pattern, suggesting repeated deposition events separated by years. And at a third site, previously considered environmentally unstable, ground radar revealed structural disturbances inconsistent with natural soil shifting. The task force no longer reacted with surprise, only confirmation fatigue. Each discovery reinforced the same conclusion. These were not isolated points. They were repetitions under similar conditions. Inside interrogation, Mercer was now being presented with reconstructed environmental simulations. Not maps, not timelines. Instead, visual models of condition spaces, abstract representations of low-surveillance environments across Florida during the 1990s and early 2000s. He watched them without interruption. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "That's closer." No one spoke immediately. The investigator asked, "Closer to what?" Mercer hesitated briefly, then replied, "What I used." The phrase, "what I used," changed the tone of the room entirely. It was the closest Mercer had come to acknowledging operational framework ownership. Not actions, not victims, but methodology. The FBI profiler observing from behind glass leaned forward slightly, noting that Mercer had shifted from passive denial to active categorization. That transition in behavioral analysis often precedes either full disclosure or total withdrawal. There was no way to predict which. The investigator continued cautiously. "Did you choose these conditions intentionally?" Mercer did not answer immediately. When he did, it was not direct. "I didn't create them." A pause. "I noticed them." That distinction mattered, because it separated agency from environment. It suggested Mercer was not claiming authorship of conditions, but recognition and exploitation of them. Outside, media coverage intensified again as newly confirmed remains from multiple sites were quietly linked through internal briefings. While officials did not release full details, leaks suggested that at least 3 separate victims had now been confirmed across different counties, all aligning with Mercer's reconstructed operational corridors. Public response shifted again. The narrative was no longer about one disappearance. It was about a pattern of exploitation of systemic blind spots over decades. Inside Mercer's interrogation, fatigue was becoming more visible. Not emotional breakdown, but cognitive slowing between responses. His pauses lengthened. His attention drifted slightly more often toward the table rather than the investigators. But his structure remained intact. When asked again about Melissa Grant specifically, Mercer finally responded after a long silence. She was not supposed to be there. The investigator immediately followed. Where? Mercer did not answer directly. Instead, he said, inside a window that wasn't